Hello, everyone. This is the first lecture of two. This is the longer lecture, and covering quite a bit of material regarding the history of ethnographic film, so as to prepare for our discussion of Leviathan in the subsequent lecture. Now, I've entitled this lecture for sensory ethnography in the cinema of exploration, Explore and Salvage, a Path Through the History of Ethnographic Film. Any history of ethnographic film, in its diverse contexts, can only be well served by paying close attention to how films aesthetically organize access to knowledge and affect for an imagined and anticipated audience. Alison Griffiths succinctly frames the issue around how the organization of vision, or the ethnographic gaze, is crucial to gaining some insight into the complexities of the ethnographic film. As a discursive category, Griffiths asserts, ethnographic film refers less to a set of unified significatory practices or to the anthropological method of intense fieldwork than to the looking relations between the initiator of the gaze and the recipient. Taken together, I hope to illuminate some of the key assumptions underlying the practice of ethnographic filming and its evolution throughout the 20th century. In addition to epistemological stakes, to questions of knowledge and vision, concerns related to colonialism and decolonization raise the issue of power and politics as crucial to understanding how ethnographic film operates, thus unfolding our discussion into post-colonialism, postmodernism, and beyond. Reflecting on ethnographic film's political historicity, Emile de Brigard writes, quote, ethnographic film began as a phenomenon of colonialism and has flourished in periods of change, socialist revolution, democratic reform, independence for developing nations. Nicholas Mirzoff neatly captures something of the ethnographic problematic in the title of his recent Counter-History of Visuality, The Right to Look. The claim to the right to visualize another culture or people is bound to an authority and a procedure of authorization, that is, a discursive practice that has material effects, formed by, quote, a set of relations combining information, imagination, and insight into a rendition of physical and psychic space. As Mirzoff explains, the right to look, and further, the right to be seen, works in tandem with forces that classify and legislate the sensible world, but it can also be, and indeed historically has been, mobilized by those who find themselves the objects of power in order to effect political and social transformation, connected to notions of the real, as that which inspires aesthetic reflection and action. Invoking the notion of the salvage paradigm in his recent study, Savage Preservation, the Ethnographic Origins of Modern Media Technology, Brian Hockman contends that, quote, even as the turn-of-the-century project of cultural preservation naturalized so-called primitive races as the disappearing objects of human history, it also established audiovisual media as the permanent records of their remains. And it was around this time, in the early decades of the 20th century, that the historical particularism of anthropologist Franz Boas of France was starting to gain ground. On the one hand, Boas's humanist views on cultural relativism provided a critique of the Eurocentric evolutionism of earlier anthropologists. On the other, Boas's notion of salvage anthropology, or what later came to be identified as the salvage paradigm, can be seen as reinscribing a kind of hierarchical evolutionary model of understanding back into the comparative study of different cultures. James Clifford has diagnosed the salvage paradigm as a mythical appeal to progress or evolution, or on the other hand, a fallenness from grace, in which colonial power invests in, quote, a desire to rescue something authentic out of destructive historical changes, unquote, wrought by the encounter between Western and Indigenous, modern, and so-called primitive cultures. Reflecting on its origins in the natural sciences, Fatima Tobing-Roney describes the salvage paradigm as informed by what she calls a taxidermic impulse, which includes the redemption of something dead or on the brink of extinction by, as it were, embalming it via cinematic inscription and the later recontextualization of it in a filmic, archival, or museological assemblage. This impulse, Roney contends, speaks to a kind of fetishistic desire and, quote, doubleness of the politics of authenticity, unquote, on the part of ethnographers, who imagined, quote, the noble savage or vanishing native as simultaneously pathological and genuine. And in this way, a drive to encounter new worlds, a cinema of discovery, meets an equal drive to record and preserve, in some shape or form, and to various colonial, scientific, and or entertainment ends, that which is encountered, and therefore presumed to be on the brink of disappearance. Now, considerable debate still takes place about how and when to date the emergence of ethnographic film, and it is the salvage operation of recording other cultures and ways of life. Like much of what has been placed under the umbrella term early cinema, ethnographic film finds its origins extending at least as far back as proto-cinematic experiments with optical toys, chronophotography, and anthropometrics, and it can be located in a range of institutional and commercial spaces, from the museum to the classroom to the commercial theater. Working in a tradition of natural sciences that includes Etienne Jules Marais and Edward Muybridge, French physician-anthropologist Félix Louis Regnault devoted himself to the chronophotographic registration of the movement of people in his efforts to understand what he called a language of gestures. As various historians have noted, Regnault was the first filmmaker to deploy motion pictures for the systematic study of movement in a cross-cultural context. Here is a clip. Apologies for the voiceover, which has not been translated.
Costituiscono la prima applicazione delle tecniche cinematografiche in campo antropologico. Regnault realizzò queste sequenze per confrontare diversi gruppi etnici nei loro movimenti. Alcune riprese vennero effettuate all'Exposition Ethnographique di Parigi.
In 1895, Regnault turned the chronophotographic gaze toward the motion study of a West African woman making pottery at the Exposition Ethnographique de l'Afrique Occidentale. In an early instance of what Marianne Doan calls archival desire, Regnault's combination of ethnographic motion studies with archival storage, in his words, preserves forever all human behaviors for the needs of our studies. Following Regnault's practice informed by the natural sciences and sharing a number of its positivist assumptions about visual knowledge, in 1898, British ethnographer Alfred Court Haddon led a Cambridge anthropological expedition to the Torres Straits that involved the use of the Lumiere camera to record the natives he encountered. While only fragments of this footage remain, a number of other British ethnographers followed Haddon's lead in employing film cameras in the field. Among those who followed in Haddon's footsteps is notably Sir Baldwin Spencer on his expeditions to Australia in 1901 and 1912. Spencer's footage has since been collected and archived at the National Museum of Victoria in an effort, as Pello Chosi writes, to fix in time images of a culture and ways of life inexorably doomed to disappear.
Seguendo l'esempio della spedizione di Cambridge, Spencer riprese le tribù aborigeni dell'Australia centrale. Ecco una delle cerimonie di Tingala.
As with Regnault, we see how early ethnographers in the field also engaged with what they perceived as a tension between the ever-encroaching modern world of mobility and motion, exemplified by the very recording equipment they employed, and the need to document and preserve in the archive a precarious indigenous people as fixed, isolatable phenomena of an emerging and consolidating ethnographic gaze. For some anthropologists and film historians, ethnographic films, or films of ethnographic value with degrees of ethnographicness, as Carl Heider once put it, were produced by both professional and amateur anthropologists and scientists, as well as by artists, explorers, and entrepreneurs. Foremost among the latter was Thomas Edison in the United States and the Lumiere brothers in France. Neither of these amateur and commercial filmmakers considered themselves anthropologists or ethnographers, but rather innovators and showmen who employed their craft to various aspects of modern life, including colonial contexts. Edison and W.K.L. Dixon, for example, filmed Sioux Ghost Dance in Edison's New Jersey Black Maria studio in 1894 as part of a larger commercial enterprise, and to demonstrate the wonders of a new recording technology by using popular subjects of the time, in this case North American Indians, who were, as Griffiths points out, a common attraction at contemporaneous World's Fairs. In this way, Edison's film, a popular entertainment in its own right, serves posterity as one of the earliest cinematic documents of both a cultural practice and late 19th century Euro-American stereotypes and imaginations about indigenous cultural practices. A more scientifically and anthropologically grounded version of the salvage paradigm would come to inform the practice of one of the best-known anthropologists of the 20th century, Margaret Mead, a student of Franz Boas and an inheritor of Regnault's interest in recording and interpreting the physical, gestural language of indigenous peoples. Mead and her then partner Gregory Bateson traveled to various indigenous cultures in Australia and the Pacific Islands, notably Samoa, throughout the 1930s, and would conduct a famous frame-by-frame analysis of a Balinese dance in their 1942 Balinese character. From Boas, Mead not only retained a cultural relativism that prompted her to attempt to observe her subjects with as few a priori assumptions as possible, but also an epistemology that focused on the body as the privileged site of cultural meaning and expression, and thus a methodology that championed photography and cinema as indispensable to ethnographic research and analysis. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, ethnographic images and tropes had fully emerged in mainstream Western culture and entertainment, as evident in the popularity of the Fleischer brothers' Betty Boop's Bamboo Isle in 1932, and Marion C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedsack's 1933 production of King Kong, both works drawing from a repository of ethnographic tropes and cliches in their depiction of the apparent savagery of indigenous island cultures. Drawing on the critical theory of Fatima Tobing-Roney, Joanna Bolden has developed a reading of Betty Boop's Bamboo Isle in terms of what Roney calls the ethnographic fascination with cannibalism in the West's obsessive pursuit of images of the so-called primitive other. Bolden writes in particular of the way the use of the rotoscope technique in the film, involving tracing over of live-action bodies in constructing highly realistic animated bodies, draws an intimate, even fetishistic connection between visual spectacle, the body of the dancing anthropological subject, and the animated star, Betty Boop's mimetic appropriation of another culture in the form of realist animated movement. According to Bolden, Betty Boop's hula dance, quote, recreates one of the most common scenarios in the genre of ethnographic film. The dance of the indigenous woman, her naked body revealed to the hungry gaze of the colonial camera. Historically, this body has been constructed as exotic, primitive, and unquestionably available for the viewer's erotic consumption. Here is a clip.
nothing yet. Watch me.
As we see in this clip from Betty Boop's Bamboo Isle, Betty, hula dancing to the soundtrack recorded by the Royal Samoan Musical Ensemble, outperforms the dancing group of indistinguishable natives. But what they both share, through the rotoscope technique and authentic recordings of sound, including clapping, shouting, and other instrumentation, is an investment in the exotic other as an object available to visual and sensual display in and as the image. And it is in its strange mimetic entanglement with various aspects of ethnographic desire and realist representation, then, that the popular animated film seems to anticipate Margaret Mead's more ostensibly sober, scientific, and documentary concern with the bodies and gestures of her Balinese subjects. And it is also worth mentioning here that Mead champions the imaged as being of central importance to anthropology for the remainder of her life, as evinced in her well-known career retrospective essay from the 1973 Second International Conference on Visual Anthropology. This essay, A Visual Anthropology in a Discipline of Words, relates that while culture might be relativized, the positive investment in an objective cinematic image for a visual ethnographic epistemology is held secure. Not long after Mead published Visual Anthropology in a Discipline of Words, visual anthropologist J. Ruby laid out a critique of some of the assumptions implicit in the work of anthropologists like Mead and Carl Heider. Ruby rejects what he calls the positive position that meaning resides in the world and that human beings should strive to discover the inherent, immutable, and objectively true reality. Instead, he argues, quote, "We are beginning to assume that human beings construct and impose meaning on the world. We create order, we don't discover it." Leaving aside the problematic idealism of Ruby's critique that order only comes from humans or ethnographers, it does point to the paradigm shift taking place around 1914 with the release of Edward S. Curtis's In the Land of the Headhunters, later renamed In the Land of the War Canoes, and later affirmed by Robert Flaherty's Nanook of the North in 1922. Part of the larger trend toward feature-length narratives in silent film production, War Canoes was shot in the Pacific Northwest of Canada and casts a group of Kwakiutl Indians in a scripted, fictional, picturesque romance that, when considered an ethnographic film, however ensconced in the ideological trappings of the Salvage paradigm, nevertheless documents a number of authentic Kwakiutl cultural practices of the recent past. Furthermore, as David McDougall and later Brian Winston point out, Curtis's film is decisively different from its ethnographic predecessors in that it takes its footage, whether staged or unstaged, and organizes it into a demonstrative, in this case, narrative film. In Nanook of the North, Flaherty further developed the demonstrative ethnographic film by building his narrative not out of a fictional romance, but rather the everyday life of his Inuit subjects in relatively self-contained vignettes. Where Curtis imposed a contrived narrative upon his native subjects, Flaherty has his subject matter, his action, emerge from the Inuit people and their customs specific to survival in the North. Flaherty did not consider himself an ethnographer, but given the dynamic between realism and myth, authenticity and modernity in the film, it is not surprising, perhaps, that John Grierson would do Flaherty the honor of considering Nanook, along with his next film, Moana, from 1926, as one of the first instances of the documentary film. Later films in the romantic tradition of Nanook, like Jean Rouche's Les Maîtres Fous from 1955, John Marshall's The Hunters from 1958, and Robert Gardner's Dead Birds from 1963, employ devices like voiceover and ambient sound in conjunction with observational and impressionistic camera work to provide not only portraits of their respective cultural groups and practices, but to generate insights into the ethnographer's own ideas about their subjects. Dead Birds, in particular, uses the indexicality and authenticity of its ethnographic depiction of the Dani people of New Guinea to empirically ground its ambitions to meditate on what it holds are universal and metaphysical themes of life, violence, sex, and death. A clip.
There is a fable told by a mountain people living in the ancient highlands of New Guinea about a race between a snake and a bird. It tells of a contest which decided if men would be like birds and die, or be like snakes which shed their skins and have eternal life. The bird won, and from that time, all men, like birds, must die. Among those who tell why men must die is Wayak. His name means wrong, for as a child he showed unreasonable rage. As a man he learned to govern his temper, and though neither very rich nor very powerful, he has the respect of all with whom he lives. He is a warrior, a farmer, and leader of the band of men who guard the most dangerous sector of a frontier which divides themselves from their enemy. Often, while at his post, he busies himself with weaving, a task all men perform.
Although he abandoned voiceover after Dead Birds, Gardner would nevertheless return again and again throughout his career to lyrical and philosophical themes embodied in the specific cultural practices of his chosen subjects, perhaps never more poetically than in Forests of Bliss from 1986, his enigmatic, near-silent masterpiece set to the everyday rhythms of life and death in the holy Indian city of Benares. Returning to Ruby's point that the ethnographic filmmaker creates or imposes rather than discovers order and meaning, it is worthwhile here to focus for a moment on the French ethnographic filmmaker Jean Rouch, whose films form a self-conscious bridge or synthesis between the romanticism and humanism of filmmakers like Robert Flaherty and the modernism and sophistication of the Soviet documentarian Dziga Vertov. In his essay, The Camera and Man, Rouch would term this combination of Flaherty and Vertov the cine eye ear. Among the elements Rouch took from Flaherty were narrative forms designed to marry the contingencies of what transpires pro-filmically in the field to a specific idea and the subjectivity of the ethnographer participant observation, which was increasingly becoming part of the ethnographic method since Bronislaw Malinowski's Argonauts of the Western Pacific, published in 1922, which also argued that ethnographers need to understand the culture from the point of view of the natives themselves. And he also took from both, through Flaherty and Mead, a cultural relativism that challenged racist assumptions implicit inside evolutionary models of culture. From Vertov, Flaherty took a concern with decoding everyday life through the dialectical collision of the observation of life caught unawares with cinematic technology and techniques, including montage, jump cuts, close-ups, etc. All of this contribute to Rouch's conception of what he called shared anthropology, meaning essentially the shared production of meaning between the filmmaker or ethnographer or anthropologist and their objects of knowledge, thus reconstituting these objects as co-subjects. This was deeply informed by Rouch's effort to remake anthropology itself as a visual and filmic medium, one that overcame the prioritization of words or text over the visual, the embodied, and the experiential. Rouch would combine these different, at times conflicting, catalytic impulses to forge what he and sociologist Edgar Morin would term, after Vertov's Kino Pravda, cinema verite. Cinema verite can be translated into English as film truth, referring to the conjunction of the cinematic apparatus with socio-historical pro-filmic reality as a kind of event with its own emergent and transformative reality. Vertov's and Rouche's mutual emphasis on the self-consciousness of the camera was distinctly modern, and best exemplified in Rouche and Edgar Morin's highly reflexive documentary Chronique d'un été from 1961. Anna Grimshaw has written of the work of Rouche and Morin in terms of how, quote, each figure was committed to plunging the camera into the midst of a world in flux. The spontaneous, improvised quality of their films, emerging from a new positioning of filmmaker and subject, technology and society, was expressive of the more general condition of fluidity in social and political life. Another significant mid-20th century development in ethnographic film has been given the umbrella term observational cinema. It was really in the 1960s that observational film consolidated its powers, mobilizing new technologies, including the smaller handheld audiovisual recording equipment and sync sound, for a greater emphasis in both design and subject on process, including social processes and the process of filming. Following the modernist experimentation with film truth of pioneers like Vertov and Rouche, observational film challenged the conventions of narrative so carefully constructed in the ethnographic documentary. Not that observational cinema abandoned narrative, far from it, but its non-scripted fly-on-the-wall aesthetic and eschewal of voiceover, among other typical features, meant that the construction of narrative often took place in post-production. As Peter Loizos writes, observational cinema's, quote, naturalism, populism, its attempts to capture events in process, the flux of social relations, all of this meant certain limitations upon what were acceptable narrative frameworks. The aim of editing was to select peaks of ritual climax, crises, revelatory moments of arrival, departure, and of significant conversational disclosure. Unquote. In its narrowing of narrative scope and grounding of the imagination in empirical, immediately visible actualities, observational cinema heralded the emergence of a more openly subjective and embodied ethnographic film in terms of both filmmakers and subjects, allowing for other subjectivities beyond that of just the filmmaker and or a privileged individual, notwithstanding some of the comments of its early practitioners. On the other hand, observational film exemplified a stance of purported objectivity toward the world, letting those before the camera speak for themselves without filmmaker disturbance as the primary motor of the film's meaning. An important ethnographic film that can be situated between observational cinema and advances in post-observational ethnographic filmmaking concerned with the epistemology of knowing the world through the image, as well as developments in fields like semiotics, is Timothy Ash and Napoleon Chagnon's The Axe Fight from 1975. Part of a series of films about the Yanomamo Indians in Venezuela, the film combines raw images, that is, images caught on the fly and without any preparation or foreknowledge, with that same footage later recontextualized by way of voiceover explanation and interpretation about what in fact was actually happening in the apparent chaos and complexity of infratribal violence. In the filmmaker's self-reflexive willingness to return to and reinvestigate the footage, the limitations of mere observation are revealed, and the complexity and even ambiguity of the social world and the ethnographer's implication within it are possibly explored. For many scholars and ethnographers, the axe fight marks the decisive point where ethnographic film could no longer self-consciously operate with epistemological certainty or any assumptions of neutrality and non-intervention. Here is a clip from the opening of the film.
February 28th, 1971, afternoon, 10 minutes after 3. Two women are fighting with each other. Bring your camera over here. It's going to start.
This footage would then be replayed with voiceover analysis provided by anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon, providing a contextualization of the events that have transpired. Paul Henley has recently summarized that the revelation and foregrounding of the axe fight's internal contradictions, for his part, signaled what he argues was the end of the road for the legacy of, quote, event-based documentation filmmaking that stemmed not just from Margaret Mead, but from Haddon and Spencer in the earliest days of ethnographic filmmaking. This type of shift and problematic can be further understood as a development in post-observational ethnographic film, where the process-driven aspects of observational cinema became increasingly dialogical and participation-oriented. That is, if observational cinema's combination of the subjective and objective left open the possibility of ambiguity and or multiple points of view, participation-driven post-observational film mobilizes a process in which the filmmaker not only observes his or her ethnographic subjects, but comes to confront and collaborate with them in the film event itself as a social process. One of the most influential and critically discussed works to emerge from the post-observational moment is Saul Worth and John Ader's Navajo Film Themselves film series, released in 1972, in which, as Worth and Ader explain in their book Through Navajo Eyes, published to accompany the film, the objective was, quote, to determine whether we could teach people with a culture different from ours to make motion pictures depicting their culture and themselves as they saw fit. Faye Ginsberg has argued that Navajo Film Themselves helped, quote, expand the classic paradigm of ethnographic film of us always filming them, unquote. In reconfiguring the situated political dynamics of ethnographic process as participation then, the Navajo Film Themselves series can be seen as an important contribution to Ruch's shared anthropology, as well as an early example of what is now commonly referred to as indigenous media. Alongside the creation of anthropological meaning with the objects of knowledge, thus reconstituting them as co-subjects, Worth and Ader, again like Ruch, sought to remake anthropology as a visual and filmic medium, one that overcame the prioritization of words or text over the visual, as well as the embodied and the experiential. That said, the Navajo Film Themselves series and others like it have their critics. For instance, Brian Winston argues that Worth and Ader made a fatal error in their naive application of cinematic technology as a neutral recording device. They, quote, failed to see the camera as a culturally determined artifact in itself, so that whatever culturally specific documentation Worth and Ader thought they were helping to produce by providing the Navajo peoples with training and cameras was in fact already circumscribed by Western representational codes inscribed into the very materiality of the apparatus, such as the lenses designed according to the specifics of Renaissance perspective and a color system that favors Caucasian skin tones. For her part, post-colonial feminist theoretician and filmmaker Trinh T. Minh-ha blasts Worth and Ader for the way they self-righteously posited their work as teaching or giving opportunity to the Navajo peoples, all the while disavowing but relying on what she calls their white authority. Minh-ha's critique here intersects with her broader project, outlined in her seminal essay, The Totalizing Quest of Meaning, of challenging the appeals to science in, quote, the sanctified terrain of anthropology, unquote, which was founded upon and driven by a colonial hierarchy that privileges the Western individual, invariably male, as the subject of knowledge, while positioning all others as objects to be known in a totalized system of visibility. Minh-ha's critique would also find expression in what can be called her counter-ethnographic films, such as Reassemblage from 1983, shot among the people of rural Senegal, which, as Bill Nichols has observed approvingly, provides a postmodern meta-commentary on the anthropological unconscious operative in traditional ethnographic film subject positioning, itself based on value-laden notions and signifiers like here and there. The post-colonial critique of ethnographic film emerging in the 1980s would set itself to the task of deconstructing and revising many of the assumptions that informed observational cinema, or what it would come to call observationalism or visualism. As this was going on, a contemporaneous set of questions and concerns was emerging in anthropology more generally regarding ethnography as a mode of writing, in particular, as a kind of literary genre replete with its own conventions and rhetorics, often employing visual metaphors built around an ideological notion of observation. Associated with anthropologists and cultural theorists like Clifford Geertz, James Clifford, George Marcus, Johann Fabian, and Michael Taussig, among others, this critical turn heralded a crisis of representation that was referred to under the loose name of writing culture. A much-cited 1986 collection of critical and theoretical texts on the stakes of knowledge related to ethnographic writing as a practice intimately connected to the politics of colonialism. The work of Trinh T. Minh-ha and the writing culture critique presented an opportunity to rethink the simplistic dichotomy established in anthropological thought and practice around the terms image and word and how they function, as Peter Ian Crawford explains in, quote, ethnographic writing and filming, or rather, between textual and cinematic anthropology. The focus on representation emphasizes the relativity of the ethnographic enterprise as a kind of textual knowledge production linked to conventions of generic and narrative tropes. Crawford thus also elects Minh-ha's Reassemblage as a paradigmatic text for understanding the shift in filmic ethnography from representation to evocation, what he refers to as a knowing, ironic transformation from the conventions of the fly on the wall, including observation, subtitles, interviews, and so forth, to a textual politics of the fly in the eye, meaning disjunctive montage, collage, ironic modes of address, overt aestheticization, and so forth. In the voiceover to Reassemblage, Minh-ha presents her anti-authoritative position in terms of not intending to speak about, but to speak nearby her subjects.
Scarcely 20 years were enough to make 2 billion people define themselves as underdeveloped. I do not intend to speak about, just speak nearby.
In his essay, The Camera People, Elliot Weinberger evocatively caricatures what he takes to be the prototypical position of anthropologists and ethnographic filmmakers alike toward the idea of the aesthetic. Anthropologists, he writes, worship a terrifying deity known as reality, whose eternal enemy is its evil twin, art. They believe that to remain vigilant against this evil, one must devote oneself to a set of practices known as science. Their cosmology, however, is unstable. For decades, they have fought bitterly amongst themselves as to the nature of their God and how to serve him. They accuse each other of being secret followers of art. The worst insult in their language is aesthetic. The role of aesthetics in ethnography and in ethnographic film is interestingly illuminated by considering how the art world in the 1980s and early 90s appropriated elements of anthropology and ethnography into its practices and aspirations. An important parallel to the postmodern writing culture revisionist approach to ethnography, the art world problematically and dynamically engaged with the ethnographic imaginary and began to show interest in traditional anthropological subjects, as well as to employ elements of its methodologies, such as fieldwork, participant observation, and site-specific exploration, and so on, into its aesthetic vocabulary. In his critical appraisal of this development, the essay, The Artist as Ethnographer, however, Hal Foster contends that one of the chief effects of all of this was to produce a kind of depoliticizing over-identification with the other, figured chiefly as either the proletariat or the post-colonial subject, and a move away from critical distance. This state of affairs in the art world provoked a number of responses from within the realms of academic anthropology and ethnographic film. Among them was a re-entrenchment of disciplinary boundaries in visual anthropology on the one hand, and a reappraisal of the value of art and aesthetics in the practice and criticism of ethnographic film on the other. In this way, What is now referred to as the sensory turn in visual anthropology and ethnographic film and media can, at least in part, be understood as a new kind of 21st century realism that starts to emerge when the emphasis on language, textuality, and cultural relativism begins to exhaust itself or become itself a kind of orthodoxy from the late 1990s. If the post-colonial other, as well as the domestic self, is increasingly, if problematically, being given or taking the opportunity to speak in its own name and in its own voice, as well as taking the means of production into its own hands, then it is interesting to see how the next big revolution, in David McDougall's terms, emerges from the problem of sense itself, and how the things and objects of the world, from animals to the environment to the products of mass industry and beyond, themselves manifest, communicate, and express themselves in diverse ways. Reinvigorated by an engagement with the boundaries of phenomenology, affect, and materialism, this new aesthetic realism, as it were, also reasserts the primacy of the aesthetic in the reconsideration of ethnographic film. And in this way, for example, where previously observation was first held up as a positivist scientific method for collecting data, as in Regnault, to something being unequally shared between subjects, to then being critically unpacked as an ideologically loaded cultural practice, or as a kind of textual convention and trope connected to colonialism, now is conceived in a far more sympathetic light that casts it as one, albeit still privileged, aesthetic among others. Indeed, drawing on what can be considered a critique of the critique of visuality, or what filmmaker and Harvard Sensory Ethnography Lab co-founder Lucian Casting-Taylor calls iconophobia, the sensory turn is in some measure a delayed response to Margaret Mead's 1975 call for visual anthropology to assert its exploratory powers in a discipline of words. So we will turn to the SEL and the sensory ethnographic film Leviathan in the next lecture. Thank you.